Hi there everyone. Welcome to this week's video where we're going to talk about Plato's Euthyphro dialogue. If you know the name of one philosopher in the history of philosophy, that philosopher is most likely Socrates. Socrates was an ancient Greek philosopher living in Athens in roughly 400 BC, so roughly almost 2,500 years ago. Socrates is enormously influential and is something like, as I say here, an exemplar of philosophy, what philosophy means, how it is that one should live as a philosopher, and so on. So for the beginning of our course, we're going to follow Socrates through some of the most important events in his life. We begin today with Plato's Euthyphro dialogue. It's important to begin by noting that Socrates did not himself write. He is not the author of the Euthyphro, even though he is featured in it as sort of the main character, as it were. This is importantly related to his character. Socrates claimed to love wisdom, but not to be wise. And this is an interesting part of his character. He's this really honored old guy who was a war hero and so on, and he basically goes around Athens asking anyone and everyone who will talk with him whether they will teach him about certain concepts in philosophy. So Socrates always positions himself as a sort of perpetual beginner, and always a student, never a master, right? And it's precisely because he does that that he comes to take on this important air of philosophy. Philosophy is described as the love of wisdom, right? Philia Sophia. And Socrates, importantly, claims to love wisdom. He pursues wisdom as a student, but he does not claim to be wise. This will become complicated in the next dialogue that we're going to look at, but we can leave things here for now. The important point to keep in mind is that Socrates was importantly different than this other group of ancient Greek thinkers prominent in Athens during this time, namely the Sophists. Sophism describes a vocation or a profession that's quite similar to what we would now describe as lawyers. They were professional arguers, in particular with rhetoric and speeches. So in essence, they would go around and they would claim to be wise. They would claim to have the ability to, teach your child, for example, how to become a good king and statesman and leader and so on, right? And they would charge people money for their services. In contrast, Socrates never asks for a fee, and while they claim to have knowledge that they want you to pay for, he claims that he doesn't have knowledge and instead wants to help everyone else acquire knowledge. We're going to see, especially next week, how this attitude becomes sort of the ethos of philosophy. It becomes the style of philosophical thinking in the Western tradition. We're starting out with a Euthyphro dialogue, which starts basically in the middle, with Socrates outside of a courthouse. We know that he's been accused of corrupting the youth, and we're going to see those charges brought to fruition in our next video. But for now, Socrates is standing around in anticipation of his trial, and he comes across Euthyphro. Euthyphro has a reputation for being pious, which means something like divine, right? He's loved by the gods, as we'll discuss in more detail in just a moment. And so Socrates, having been accused of wrongdoing, is interested to learn from Euthyphro about the nature of piety. Now, it's going to turn out that Socrates ends the dialogue in confusion. So Euthyphro doesn't give him a satisfying answer, but part of the joy of the dialogue is working through the problem. Even if we don't arrive at any kind of doctrine, we aren't told what to believe about piety, we learn something by going through the investigation together. Now, to begin with, when Socrates starts asking Euthyphro about what the nature of piety is, Euthyphro gives a lot of examples. One thing that Euthyphro says is, well, what I'm doing right now is pious, because Euthyphro was charging his father in an Athenian court of law for killing his slave. Given the lower status of slaves and the importance of familial relationships with one's parents in ancient Greek society, this was seen as highly notable and unusual that Euthyphro would go through with this process. But here Socrates says something really important that I think is very subtle but is important for understanding what philosophy is. Socrates says, "Bear in mind that I did not bid you tell me one or more of the many pious actions, but the form itself that makes pious actions pious." In other words, Euthyphro tried to answer Socrates' question by providing examples of piety. Well, piety is what I'm doing right now, Socrates, right? But Socrates responds by saying, well, that's not really what I'm interested in when I'm doing philosophy. When I'm doing philosophy, I'm trying to discover the general form that makes all pious actions pious. So, for example, even if Socrates were to agree with Euthyphro and hold that Euthyphro was pious for prosecuting his father, it's unclear what Socrates could infer from that about his own behavior, right? Without any investigation as to what made that action pious, Socrates can't figure out what other actions are pious. And this is typical of philosophy. Philosophy asks a lot of big what is questions. In this case, what is piety? We're going to investigate a number of other big what if questions, including what is certainty? What is uncertainty? What is right? What is wrong? All sorts of questions of this nature. And so it's going to be a general characteristic of Socrates in Plato's dialogues that he's looking for the form of whatever it is that he's investigating. He's not looking for examples, right? And so after Euthyphro is agitated by Socrates for a while, it's an important part of Socrates' characterization that he's portrayed as annoying, right? And he's doing kind of childish behavior, which is like going around to all of the adults on the town square and asking to become their students, right? There's this comical element of Socrates' character. So anyway, Socrates annoys Euthyphro enough that Euthyphro gives an answer. To be pious is to be loved by the gods. But here, Socrates asks a really brilliant question that's come to be known as the Euthyphro dilemma. Socrates says, quote, "Consider this. Is the pious being loved because it is pious? Or is it pious because it is being loved?" Now, this question is really subtle, right? And essentially, it can be very difficult to understand because it kind of just sounds like Socrates is like repeating pious loved, pious loved, pious loved like a bunch of times in the sentence, right? But Socrates is asking this question: which is the cause and which is the effect? Is the love the effect of the piety, or is the love the cause of the piety? The first option, is the pious being loved because it is pious, is saying that the cause of its being loved is piety, right? In other words, actions are pious and then they were subsequently loved by the gods. By contrast, the second option asks, is it pious because it is being loved? On this account, the love comes first, and the piety is a consequence of the love. And it's going to turn out that no matter how Euthyphro answers this question, his answer is unsatisfying. Let's take the first half, the first horn of the dilemma, what I've written here in blue. In this case, piety causes love. Actions are pious, and then as a result, the gods decide to love them. This is sometimes called moral realism, right? In other words, things that are morally right and are morally wrong are facts about the world. And our judgments that they are morally right or they are morally wrong are subsequent to those facts. We come to recognize those facts as true, and hence we develop a system of morality. So good things are good, and then we judge them to be good. In this case, notice that the judgment is irrelevant to Socrates' question. If the gods love piety because to be pious is good, then this still leaves our central question unanswered: what makes pious actions pious? In other words, the answer that Euthyphro provides about God's loving piety is irrelevant to the question that Socrates asks. The second horn of the dilemma, if you take the piety to be an effect of God's love, in other words, God chooses to love certain things and then he calls those things pious, the judgment precedes the quality, the piety, then we would call this a divine command theory. Things become pious because God says so, right? Now, importantly, this theory is also dissatisfying because it doesn't explain why gods choose to love what they love. In other words, it makes God's choosing to love certain actions as pious appear arbitrary. And if it is arbitrary, then it's impossible to answer Socrates' questions about the form itself that makes pious actions pious. I hope that with this dialogue, more than anything else, you can take in just how much philosophy can happen in just a couple of lines. It really is incredible the wealth of material and philosophical argumentation that we can get out of this small text written almost 2,500 years ago. Now, do you agree with Socrates' reasoning in the dialogue? Why or why not? I very much look forward to hearing what you think.